In early 20th century, many Chinese scholars studied the Western culture to increase their interaction with the West. But there were some scholars who had great influence in Western society. At that time, there was a popular saying, if you go to Peking, you may give a visit to the old imperial palace, but you must not miss a chance to see Gu Hongming.
Gu Hongming was born in 1857. His ancestral home was in Xiamen, Fujian. 4 generations of his family were overseas Chinese. He grew up in Penang Island, a British colony. Since his childhood, he was infected by Western themes and Western culture. Later, he went abroad to study for many years. He went abroad to Europe to study English literature at the University of Edinburgh in the United Kingdom in 1873, and then he went to study at the University of Leipzig in Germany in 1877. He was proficient in English, German, French, Russian, Latin, and other languages. He later even studied Japanese. He studied in the West for many years and was deeply absorbed in Western history and the scientific community. By 1880, Gu had returned to Lanyang and his encounter with Ma Zhang in Singapore, which triggered his interest in traditional Chinese learning, and finally he decided to return to China. On the one hand, he worked in Zhang Zhidong's office. On the other hand, he engaged in traditional Confucianism research.
Returning from Europe to China, Gu Hongming says he experienced a conversion from an imitation Westerner to a Chinaman again. Gu Hongming was very keen on studying the Confucianism, and he's translated 3 Confucius classes to English, including 论语, the discourses and sayings of Confucius in 1898, 中庸, the universal order in 1906, and 大学, higher education in 1915. In 1885, he started serving as a private secretary of the Viceroy, Zhang Zhidong, and his service ended in 1909 when Zhang Zhidong died. During the time he worked there, Gu Hongming published a very important work, Papers from the Viceroy Yamen, a Chinese plea for the cause of good government and true civilization in China. In this work, he denounces the imperialism and scolds the missionary. Unfortunately, his thought about the West was not welcomed by many other intellectuals in China. After he had shortly worked at the South Sea Public School, Gu Hongming started teaching at the Peking University in 1915. He was treated with hostility there by some new cultural movement radicals, including the founders of the Chinese Communist Party, Chen Dushou and Li Dachao. Owing to the attacks from those radicals, he chose to leave the Peking University. Eventually, he departed for Japan in 1924.
Gu Hongming was an influential person in the spread and interchange of Chinese and Western cultures. He played an important role on promoting the Chinese cultures to the world. Although he studied in Western country when he was young, he was still a practitioner of Confucianism, and his perseverance and promotion of Confucianism achieved the positive results. especially in the influence to the Western world at the time. He was the first translator who introduced Confucian classics to the West. He translates 3 of the Confucian classic texts from the 4 books into English language, including Analysis of Confucius, The Great Learning, and the Doctrine of the Mean, which illustrating the main values and ethics in Confucianism. In order to show his determination on promoting the traditional Chinese virtues to the West, Gu Hongming translated the representative classic texts of Confucianism. He aimed to eliminate the prejudice of the West against the Chinese through the translation, so that he started his work on translating Analects of Confucius, and to further explain the ideas in the texts. He found that there were cultural differences between the West and China, so he made his translation conform to the cultural background of the West, and quote the classic speeches of Chinese history at the same time. Therefore, the Chinese classics texts were originally obscure for Western people, but it became more easy to understand through the translated version by Gu Hongming. Through the text readings of translation, the Western people could know more about the strength of Chinese virtues and eliminate their bias against China, but to appreciate the Chinese culture instead. There is no doubt to say that the spread of Chinese classics to the West is contributed to Gu Hongming because he showed his translation skill and cultural confidence on his translation. Therefore, he played an important role on helping to open up the channels for the spread of Chinese Confucian classics to the West, and thus create a better chance for Western people to know more about Chinese culture.
After the 1911 revolution successfully turned China into a republic, Gu emerged as a Confucian prophet prescribing Chinese civilization. His works were neglected by elite intellectuals of the time who were busy learning from the West. During a time when Westernization became increasingly hegemonic in intellectual circles, Gu provided a convenient target for radicals to attack. Prominent intellectual leaders and founders of the Chinese Communist Party, Chen Duxiu and Li Dachao, denounced the reactionary Gu Hongming and warned of the dangers of his ideas in society. Ironically, such attacks have helped boost Gu's fame. Japan intensified its movements towards militarism in the early 20th century. Facing to the increasingly critical of Japan's growing ultranationalism and militarism in 1920s, Gu continued to hail Japan as the career of the real Chinese culture and thus the natural leader of Pan-Asian solidarity. While such stances were attacked by his Chinese college and students in Republican Beijing, Gu received continuous financial and moral support from the group of Japanese scholars promulgating Confucian morality in Japan. Since the 19th century, intellectuals around the world engaged in discourses on the nature of civilization. The discussion to anxiously sought alternatives to Western approaches to reconstruct the moral and philosophical foundations of civilization gave a flavor to Gu's works. Intellectuals from many different cultures debated the implication of the crisis of Western society for human civilization. Gu
Gu Hongming's success was largely due to the rise of anti-modern sentiments among Westerners in the post-World War I era, as well as his role as polarizer of Chinese culture for a general Western audience.
The case of Gu Hongming can be said both representative and unique example of the China cultural interchange with the others. On the one hand, Gu was growing up in Western country and accept the Western education. Although he started learning the Chinese culture after he came to China, he has deep affection for Chinese culture. However, he promotes the traditional Chinese culture, Confucianism, to the Western world through translate different Chinese classics to English. For Gu Hongming, he gained fame as a principal representative of traditional Chinese culture in his lifetime, and the main method of his promotion is translation. It is the representative pattern in China cultural interchange with others that translate the Chinese classical or literature to Westerner for understand the Chinese culture, as it is more effective way to learn the culture of a country you have never been to. On the other hand, the case of Gu can say is a unique example for China cultural interchange with others. At that time, many Chinese scholars who accept the Western education has dropped research on Chinese culture. They think that China needs to learn the Western knowledge to increase the power of China. They may translate the Western literature to Chinese or hopes to bring the Western education to China. But Gu have opposite thought. He advocates that rebuild Chinese own tradition to fight against the great power and criticize the West. Therefore, he recommends cultural conservative in China. This is the few people who are educated in the West but promote cultural conservatism at the time. Although there are many challenges of his thesis, as many Chinese scholars focusing on the Western culture at the same period, he is still actively committed to transforming and challenging Western hegemonic discourses on civilization, and become an influential person in Western society.